I asked our Facebook group ahead of this interview, said, what should I ask Gabor? And I said, look, everyone knows Dr. Gabor Maté, written a load of books, very famous for his work in trauma, particularly linking trauma and addiction, trauma in the wider social context. What should I ask him? And a lot of them just said, please say thank you. So I thought that would be a nice place to start, just passing on. It seems like your work's got incredibly popular and the world is grateful.
Well, thank you. That's so good to hear. Thanks for the acknowledgement.
Why do you think your work has got so incredibly popular? I mean, obviously you're a great writer, you're very experienced in what you do, but it's really next level. I mean, you were getting big when the conference happened, and since then, it's absolutely stellar. So why do you think the world is so interested in the work that you do?
Well, first of all, there is a shift in the zeitgeist in terms of recognizing trauma and its ubiquitous and near universal impact on human life, development, functioning. And that's just reflected not just through my work, but the success of Bessel van der Kolk's book on addiction, Bruce Perry's successes, the work of other people, Peter Levine, Stephen Porges. So there's just a phalanx of people now talking about various aspects of trauma, which is gathering a lot of public interest. Specifically, my work, I think, hits home for a number of reasons. One is my experience ranges across the whole field of human, what we call pathology, from physical illness to what we call mental illness and its relationship to trauma. And there's very few physicians who've taken that broad perspective, number one. Number two, I have done a lot of work on myself, and as my wife will tell you, continue to need to. And I share that quite openly because there's nothing to be ashamed about. And the kind of work that you opened yourself up to when you and I worked together a year ago, it's something that I just share about myself. And people, it seems to me, seem to need some permission to share their authentic experience. We live in a world where vulnerability and our so-called dysfunctions are considered to be very blameworthy and to be shamed about. And I just don't feel that way. I just think it's human stuff that we need to talk about openly. Thirdly, I have some talents. I hope I'm not saying this too egotistically, but I'm a good writer and fairly articulate speaker. So I think all that contributes to the interest in the work that I'm engaged in. And engaged in, again, far from by myself. I mean, I've learned from so many others.
Yeah, there's a whole field out there now that's hugely popular. It was definitely, your session was the most popular session from the conference, and I think of the top 10 sort of watched ones, at least 5 of them were related to trauma. That just didn't really surprise me. I mean, what about you personally? So I know people have asked me, they said, look, you're talking to Gabor again. We want to know about him personally. We love his work. His work's all in his books. Is there something you'd be willing to share about how, your personal upbringing led you to be dedicated to the work you do?
Well, so I've talked I don't need to repeat the story of my infant trauma. The Jewish baby living under Nazi-occupied regime in Hungary and barely surviving the war, and separation from my mom and all the grief, the family tragedies. And then I grew up in a very interesting and part of the world, and there's the Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. Well, I've lived in very interesting times. Second World War, communist dictatorship, Hungarian Revolution, emigration to Canada, and then my formative years. When I say formative, I mean my adolescent formative years. As I moved into adulthood, the 60s, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Beatles, So a lot of changes, a lot of perturbations, and a lot of, as I said in another interview recently, a lot of opportunity to get disillusioned in a very positive sense of the word, to lose my illusions, not to believe what official sources were telling me, because they were lying all the time. And so that having to develop a point of view of my own, and in my family too, having to develop a point of view of my own, always sensing that there's some kind of a gap between what the adults were saying and what reality was. So all that went into it. And you know, being a physician, if your eyes are open, especially if your heart is open, you can't help but be moved by human suffering, and you can't help but wonder about the sources of it, and how to soothe it.
And
And then I'll finally say, as an adult, I had to come to terms with the traumatic imprints that I was carrying and inflicting on my spouse and on my children and on myself. So I've had to work with all that, work through all that.
how does that show up now, like in your marriage this year?
Well, I have a great marriage, but you wouldn't have thought so 2 weeks ago if you had a chance to look into our house at a particular moment, you know. So, but what we have now is the trust. After only 52 years, we have the trust that we're there for one another, and that when things go sideways, we can right them again, and we have the tools to do so. And so I've often said that for all the other work that I've done, the psychotherapy and the psychedelic work and reading and so on, the most important spiritual work we ever do is if we're in a relationship, if we're in a committed relationship, because that's where you really have to grow up. Every childhood imprint. Here's the thing, we always partner up with somebody exactly at the same level of unresolved trauma that we're at. It's like water finding its level. If my partner is up here in terms of a bit more traumatic imprint and I'm here, we'll never meet. Which also means that when people do meet, it's a real opportunity to, if they're both willing to be committed to the truth, which is the key. I mean, the question is, do you want the truth or do you want your illusions? Do you want your truth or do you want the story that justifies your point of view? Which do you want? And the same question applies across the whole field of human endeavor and interaction in politics. Do we want the truth? Or do we want to hold on to the image that we hold of ourselves as individuals or as nations or as people? That's the key question. What do we want? I'm fortunate to have married somebody that we're both committed to the truth, not that we always embody it, far from it. And I've lied enough in my life and manipulated enough. But underneath it, there's a commitment to the truth that I always do come back to.
We're both blessed that way. What do you still find difficult at this stage, and you know, all the trauma work you've done?
You know, Mark, I don't have much difficulty in the trauma work itself. I mean, and one of the things that people have noticed about me is that I'm just not afraid of pain. I'm not afraid of people's worst pain. It doesn't make me uncomfortable, whether in the context of a session like you and I had, whether in the context of a psychedelic retreat or session, whether in the context of a seminar or webinar. What I find challenging is to keep my heart open in the work, and also in personal relationships, because my defensive default mode is to kind of shut down, and then I can become, and then I can just come just from my head, which is not sufficient. So I think that's my biggest challenge.
Right to that. If someone said to you, like, very simply, hey, maybe this is their first ever trauma talk, they'd heard a thing called trauma exists, they know it's not good for them, their health, their relationship, society. If they just said to you, Dr. Maté, what works for healing trauma, what would be your response?
Well, I would begin by asking them some questions. I rarely answer questions straight out. I mean, I'm doing it in this interview, but that's the nature of this interview. But if somebody comes to me with a question like that, I'd want to ask them a bunch of questions. And so I developed this method that called compassionate inquiry, which is a bit of what I was practicing with you when you and I worked together. And we've had about 2,000 people in 80 different countries studying that. We have cohorts all over the year throughout. But the essence of it is to ask the right questions, because I know that the answer is within everybody. They just don't know how to ask the right questions. And so the right questions asked in a compassionate way, I think, will lead people to the truth about themselves. That's why I'd rather say, I would ask a lot of questions rather than give them a straight answer. Now, if they said, okay, well, what are the methods out there that work? I would say, okay, there's no one size fits all. It does depend on what you want, where you're at, what you're ready for, what you're comfortable with. But there's Peter Levine's somatic experiencing. There's Bessel van der Kolk's modalities. There's EMDR. There's brain spotting. There's Dick Schwartz's internal family systems. You know all these people. There's Pat Ogden's work. There's Janina Fisher's work. You know, so, and X number of modalities out there. You know, body work, yoga, meditation, flotation work. Oh, there's just so much out there. And there's no one size fits all.
Yeah, I noticed the body is definitely a part of a lot of them. And
yeah. And, you know, at your work, embodiment, I mean, that's, the body is the key, isn't it?
It's definitely been helpful to me. I'll say that. Okay, let's take it right to the current context. So it's been over a year since we talked publicly. The COVID situation has continued. I see a lot of people kind of run down, dysregulated, irritability. You know, talking to David Trevelyan in a kind of an extra interview we did around this, Stephen Porges as well, kind of a couple of update ones like this one. And you know, the common sort of theme from people seems like people are pretty run down, pretty dysregulated. Of course, not everyone. There are people that have had a great year. What's your sense of how trauma relates to where we're at now, the nervous system of the world today?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Stephen Porges, and you know he published this paper about how people's response to COVID very much reflects their childhood traumas, or you know, and so some people are not dysregulated; they're the fortunate ones. Others, it's in the nature of stress. When you put stress on a system, whether that's an individual organism or a social structure, it's going to reveal the fault lines that were already there, but maybe were papered over. So COVID has revealed, not so much caused, well, it certainly has exacerbated, but it's also revealed the fault lines in this society. And that's shown up in a lot of ways. For example, both in the UK and in North America, it's been certain vulnerable groups that have been most prone to get sick with COVID. That has to do with race and economic advantage or disadvantage, and it's been disproportionate. Well, that reveals a fault line that has always existed in the society, but it's become exacerbated. Some people who have got a lot richer as a result of COVID, the billionaire class has got a lot richer. They have many more billions now than they did before COVID. And that's another, and so inequality has been exacerbated. In terms of the vaccine response, this is controversial, and I know that maybe half the people listening will not very much, I don't know how many, may not like what I have to say here. I've seen a lot of irrationality in the response to the vaccine. I just put my cards on the table. I've had my third dose. I'm very grateful for it. I am not somebody who automatically believes the medical mantra. In fact, I spent my whole professional life creating a broader, or at least contributing to a broader vision, more inclusive, less mind-body separated, less corporate-based vision of medicine. And my new book is all about that as well. So I'm not somebody who buys in, but at the same time, I personally am very glad for the vaccines. I think they're a great advance, and they saved a lot of lives. And here in Canada, 90% of the people in their intensive care unit are people who are not vaccinated. So for me, there's not a whole lot of controversy about it, not in my own mind. But I've seen on both sides a lot of emotion. And I think you can have an opinion. I won't argue with somebody who doesn't want to get the vaccine. I mean, I would have a conversation, but I wouldn't argue with them. But the conspiracy theories around it, but it's all a plot and, this and that, to me, that reflects trauma. So there is the rational decision that's individual and to which, do we get the vaccine, do we not? But then there's a whole lot of irrationality on both sides, and the venom and the vituperation that goes back and forth. I think those are traumatic imprints. I don't care which side you're on.
Yeah, there's dysregulation on both sides, a lack of civility, a lack of dialogue. I've seen this around several issues. I'd push back slightly and say I think what I'd call prospiracy, thinking that pharmaceutical companies and governments aren't lying to you, can also be a sign of trauma. There can be both trauma patterns on both sides there, right?
Well, look, the pharmaceutical companies, we don't have to debate whether or not pharmaceutical companies are engaged in conspiracy. We know that they are, not just around, I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about a whole lot of other things. Look at the Sackler family and their relentless pushing of opioids, knowing that they were addictive. Billions of dollars in profits. They were slapped on the wrist. Tens of thousands have died. Nobody's going to go to jail. I mean, we know that. And we know that the food companies conspire to sell junk food. And we know that the cigarette companies have conspired to deny the impact of their product. We know that the fuel industry has conspired to deny climate change. We know that governments were complicit in this denial. So nobody has to convince me that there's willingness to conspire at the highest levels. I just don't see that in the COVID case, because I'm not listening to governments and I'm not listening to pharmaceutical companies. I'm listening to my fellow physicians who are working in the hospital, who are desperate that all these unvaccinated people are coming in with deathly illness. That's what I'm listening to. My medical colleagues whom I trust. And these are medical colleagues with whom on many issues I might disagree with. But I don't trust them. I don't mistrust their intentions.
No, neither do I. And I'm wondering if the sort of importance of co-regulation hasn't been highlighted by lockdowns or masks, wherever it is. That there's a lot of people that are essentially not co-regulating. They don't know what that term is, but are perhaps feeling it for the first time.
Well, co-regulation has been a huge issue during COVID, as you rightly point out. I mean, because we know from, there's the great phrase of Dr. Dan Siegel about interpersonal neurobiology. So our brains and our nervous systems are really connected to one another. It's all interpersonal. As a result of which, I take it a step further. It's not only our neurobiology that's interpersonal, our whole biology is interpersonal. So we know that people who are lonely, who are isolated, the immune system is more susceptible. They get sick quicker and they die faster of their illnesses. So that we, as human beings, we're created to co-create, or I should say co-regulate one another. And as you point out, for all kinds of reasons, during COVID, that has been really impaired. And people have really suffered as a result.
Yeah, it's very hard to weigh those two things. I certainly wouldn't want to be the one to try and weigh something like a social isolation, lack of co-regulation, all the ill health that comes with that, which perhaps isn't so famous with, other factors. It's a difficult one to weigh those two against each other.
Yeah, these are one of the dilemmas we have to deal with.
Okay, it's easy to sort of go doom and gloom. I think particularly with stuff going on in the world, it's pretty serious. It's midwinter here for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere. I don't know about you, but I tend to sort of go a little bit like, to the downer. And let's go the opposite way. What would a world be like where your work, the work of other trauma specialists, was just completely known, where it was part of common sense knowledge? Like, I kind of want to paint a picture for a better world.
Yeah, yes. So at the risk of, not at the risk, at the reality of self-advertising, I've just today will be finished completing the final copy edit of my next book, which will be published next September. It's called The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And the very last chapter is just about the question that you just asked. And I'm envisioning in it a trauma-informed world. Like, what if parents were informed about trauma before or as they get pregnant? Because we already know that the stresses of the mother has an impact on the child's development in the womb. What if birth practices were trauma-informed? What if we realized how we're traumatizing so many women and babies through our overly technologized and medicalized birthing practices? I'm not talking about necessary interventions, which are miraculous and beneficial and life-saving, but we've overdone it tremendously. We're interfering with the natural mother-infant bond, and that breaking of the bond itself is traumatic for the child. What if parents were given advice that is really child-friendly rather than behavior-friendly? What if parenting advice was not based on how to get a child to behave, but what are the needs of the child to develop in a healthy way? That'd be a trauma-informed. Well, since you're in Britain, I can show you this book by my friend Kate Silverton. It's called There's No Such Thing as Naughty. And it's about not focusing on behaviors, but about what is the child actually experiencing. What if schools were trauma-informed? What if they realized that all the kids with behavior problems, so-called, and learning problems, these are manifestations of trauma? What if the healthcare system was trauma-informed? What if physicians actually realized the scientific evidence available, if they were familiar with the scientific evidence that's beyond convincing? I mean, it's beyond controversy as far as I'm concerned, that trauma has a huge impact on physical health. It underlies a lot of chronic illness, whether malignancy or autoimmune disease or chronic conditions of almost any kind, from fibromyalgia to migraine headaches. What if they realized that all so-called mental health illnesses have a traumatic origin, a traumatic template, all of them, their responses to traumatic events? So what if we had a trauma-informed healthcare system? What if we had a trauma-informed legal system where the courts realized that the people that were siloing in these terrible prisons in the English-speaking world, at least, most of them are traumatized people. That's why they're there. Well, we would have a different society. And as far as doom and gloom, you know, I'm with Noam Chomsky on this one. He once said that he was asked if he was an optimist or a pessimist, and he said, well, strategically, I'm an optimist, and tactically, I'm a pessimist. And I talked to him about that. I said, is that still your view? He says, yeah. He says, if I was a pessimist in the long term, you might as well just commit suicide. So I believe in human beings. I think you believe in human beings. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing this work. I think people watching this believe in some possibility of transformation in themselves and in society. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be interested in the conversation that you and I are having. And I think that possibility of transformation and towards a more truthful way of being, it exists in every human being, even the ones who seem most shut down and unavailable. The possibility exists in them. And so the question is, how can we, each of us, do the work to open up that possibility, both on a social and on individual levels? But I do believe in that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
Gabor, thank you for what you do. And if people want to kind of find out more about your work, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, there's my website, Dr. Gabor Maté. All my events are listed there, my publications, lots of other resources. There's X number of talks of mine that have been filmed, put on YouTube. You don't have to join anything, pay anything. You just Google my name or in YouTube and you'll see dozens of talks. There's the course that I teach, Compassion and Inquiry. You can look that up. And recently there was a documentary that some people I'm sure have seen called The Wisdom of Trauma. That's been seen by about 6 million people in its first couple of showings internationally. There'll be a website dedicated to it. So go to wisdomoftrauma.com and the film will be available on the website. So then there's my books. So it's hard to avoid me these days if you're
everywhere, man. I'm so glad we got half an hour of your time. You're difficult to get. I know you're in high demand. I'd also recommend the first interview that we did was a bit longer, which was part of that's free at the moment as part of the conference. Also the panel you're on with Peter Levine, Dick Schwartz, Alanis Morissette, and I think it was Dan Segal as well. So that was a pretty epic panel. I recommend people check that one out as well from the conference. That's free today and tomorrow at the moment. We can't keep the conference free forever just because people bought it, so it wouldn't be fair for them, those who bought the recordings. But if everyone out there tells their friends today and tomorrow, it's all free if they want to have a look at it. And of course, you can get the whole library if you want to take it in your own time. Just want to warn people as well, if you are looking through the library, don't watch all the trauma ones, 20 of them in 2 days. It's just not healthy, to try and digest all that so quickly. So take it easy with that. So Gabor, thanks so much for your time. One last thing to part, from a trauma point of view, what is love?
Oh boy, you just slip in that gentle, easy little question. Let me just stay with that for a moment, because I don't want to give you something like from the top of my head. So love is actually the elixir that dissolves trauma, the traumatic imprint. And it's also what, if it was fully present, would prevent trauma in the first place. And love is also what every traumatized person is desperately looking for. Whether they're looking for it through their dysfunctional way of being in a relationship, whether they're doing it through their addictions, through their compulsions, through their work, whatever they're doing, that's what we're all looking for. So that's what love is to trauma.
Boom, Dr. Gabor Maté. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say we love you. So don't die. Keep up the good work. Thanks for doing what you do, sir. Thanks for your time. Really, Kusana, really good to see you once again.
Hope to see you again. Thank you, Mark.